I had direct P&L responsibility for this business that was now 200 million in revenue. And I was doing this at a publicly traded company. And so on paper, I was doing really well. And my boss was telling me, what other products could we have you take over since you've done such a great job of this? And there's a clear path to becoming a VP. And what's interesting about it was while I was doing well on paper, I found so much of it draining in terms of the work that I was doing. And what do I mean by that? Look, I got into product to talk to customers, design world-class features. I didn't really talk to customers as much. I had a whole team of PMs that did that. The extent at which I was designing features was product reviews. My PMs would present to me various concepts and I'd provide a little bit of feedback. And sure, I owned the high-level vision and strategy, but that day-to-day fun that I loved about product, I actually did little of. I was a head of a product, managing and leading more so than I was creating and building. And I realized that kind of work didn't sort of energize me. And I love the way Justin Kahn puts this. He talks about this idea of a zone of excellence versus a zone of genius. He says there's this zone of excellence that some of us fall into. This is work that we're really good at, but is actually very draining to us. And that's where I was at. And what he encourages you to do is find this zone of genius. The zone of genius is the work that energizes you, that you love. And so I realized that while I was doing well, if I continued on that path, I was just going to move further and further away from the parts of product that I actually love. And so I thought about, is this really the path I want to keep going down? Because I'm not sure it would really be my zone of genius.
All right, welcome everyone. My guest today is Sachin Rekhi. Sachin was LinkedIn's head of product for Sales Navigator. He scaled it to $200 million in annual revenue and over 500 employees. He then left it all behind to start NoJoy, a note-taking app for teams. So really excited to talk to Sachin about his approach to finding product market fit, the dark side of product leadership roles, and how to design work to suit your life, not vice versa. Welcome, Sachin.
Thank you, Peter. I'm excited to be here today.
All right, so let's talk about finding product market fit first. Most people start by just building an MVP and then try to get customer feedback as quickly as possible, right? But I think you have some pretty hot takes about this topic.
Totally. My take is that MVPs are largely dead. This idea of a minimum viable product where we just ship something as quickly as possible for customers and get it out there had its time and place, but these days isn't very effective. You have to keep in mind when we came up with this concept of MVPs and the lean startup back in 2008, there wasn't that much software out there. And so putting something out in the market and testing whether people would use it was very effective because people were hungry for solutions and options to go use. Now, what's interesting is MVPs are great for new market opportunities to see if there's any demand, but for existing market opportunities, they could actually point you in the wrong direction. And the reason is today people just expect so much from their software. So if you launch an MVP and people don't retain on the product, is it because you had a bad idea? Or is it just because you launched too lightweight enough of functionality that people expect a lot more? And so, for example, let's say you're building in an existing category, your MVP might be so lightweight that people liked some of the interesting concepts you're doing, but they couldn't abandon their existing tool because you didn't solve for enough of the core functionality that they need. And so you look at software like Notion, like Airtable. These companies took years before they got a product to market, very much not an MVP. And so I think that's why I believe that MVPs, in fact, are not the default way to go when you're building a startup. It really depends on what market you're attacking and how you're thinking about going after that market.
So how do you make sure you don't spend a year building something that nobody wants then? How do you do customer discovery?
Yeah, customer discovery is incredibly important, right? And the key is that we can leverage customer feedback, customer interviews, conversations with customers to make sure we're headed in the right direction. But here's the interesting thing. I think a lot of people even do that wrong. And I think the challenge people have with customer discovery is this whole idea of confirmation bias, right? That I'm going in kind of wanting you to like my product. And when I'm interviewing and asking you questions about my product, I'm asking you things like, do you have this problem? that my product attempts to solve. And the reality is most people can be like, yeah, sure, I have the problem. But what you really want to know, is it an acute problem? Is it a top concern of them that they're willing to sort of adopt a new product for it? And just asking that question isn't very useful. Similarly, asking a question like, oh, if I built this, would you use it? People like to be nice and they're generally going to be like, yeah, sure, I'll use it. But there's no commitment there that's really going to drive them to using it. So I think we have to be smarter about how we're doing customer discovery to really drive real insights. So let me give you an example of doing it better. So let's say, for example, I want to ask someone in a B2B setting about sort of how acute the problem is that I'm trying to solve for them. What I do is I'd start by saying, okay, in your role, whatever that role is, tell me the top 5 problems or challenges you face on a regular basis. And so they might list off the top 5. Then I'll come in and say, hey, here's the problem we're thinking about solving for the customer. And then I'll ask them, can you rank globally the initial list of problems you gave me plus the problem I said we're solving? Now, what's interesting is if they're like, oh, great, 2 of my problems I put higher, but I put your problem third. Okay, great. You've identified a top 3 problem. But if they keep putting the problem that you've identified on the bottom of the list, let me tell you, you have a nice to have, you have a vitamin, you don't have a painkiller. And so that gets them to really make trade-offs, which is how you get to true customer insight on what in fact is actually going to move the needle on a product and service that they might actually adopt versus simply being nice and telling you, yeah, sure, I'll use it.
Yeah. Like I get so many DMs every day from startup founders who are like, here's my product. Do you want to use it or not? Do you want to give it a try? And yeah, I think that's like, nobody has actually asked me, hey, what problems do you struggle with during the day or try to do your job? Nobody has asked me that question. So it's definitely a very interesting framing, right? Yeah.
Totally.
And we both work at big companies. So, personally, I'm like pretty allergic to writing 50-page business plans before building anything. But maybe the pendulum has swung too much in the MVP direction. Where do you fall on this debate?
It's one of these fascinating things when you look at the history of it. Lean startup basically convinced us writing a 50-page, business plan and then ultimately spending a couple of years building the product and then finding out whether people care after launching it was a terrible idea. And it's true. That is a terrible idea. That takes years before you get something in market. But I do think that the pendulum has swung way too far. And today we talk about this as like execution is the only thing that matters. All we need to do is execute, put stuff out there and see what sticks. But I believe actually we should be more strategic about that. And actually some upfront thoughtful planning is critically important. And here's why. We're all navigating this idea maze of the space that we're trying to build a product in, right? We're trying to decide what problem in particular do we solve. We're trying to decide what target audience we go after. And when you look at that idea maze, you're like, there's so many dimensions that you can pivot on. And if you're just experimenting and executing, you're trying lots of things, but that idea maze is huge. You're never going to get a chance to test through all of it. And being thoughtful about your point of entry, about the target audience you're going after, which problem you're solving, is going to help narrow that search pit space. So execution still matters, but we want to be reducing the amount of experiments we have to run to actually figure out where the actual opportunity might be, because we're all sort of limited on runway. And so I like to think about this as actually strategy matters a ton. Yes, we need to execute, but in fact, we have to be strategic about what problems we're solving, what target audience we're going after, what's our unique value proposition. And in doing so, we reduce the amount of experiments we need to run and hopefully find product market fit before we run out of runway.
Yeah, I mean, it's still much cheaper to think than to actually try to ship something, especially since the quality bar for MVP has gone up by a lot from consumers, right?
That's exactly right.
And you have this really awesome, you teach this course about product market fit. You have this deliberate product market fit loop. Can you walk through the steps at a high level first?
Yeah. So the idea is that I think we've learned so much since the days of the lean startup on how to build a product right and how to find product market fit for a new product. And so this deliberate startup methodology that I teach in my course really tries to give you that more rigorous approach, a more modern approach on how we've learned to really go through this hunt for product market fit. And the idea we talk about is there's this core loop that you're constantly going through to find product market fit. It starts by defining a PMF narrative, which is really just a fancy way of saying your initial strategy for how you're going to win in the market you're going after, and taking some time to be thoughtful about that as opposed to rushing to just build. The second part of the loop is actually validating your riskiest assumptions. Now, this is the idea that we want to be aware of all the validation techniques we could potentially leverage and pick the one that's most appropriate for what is the riskiest dimension. Third, we want to constantly be measuring, do we have product market fit or not? And we can do that in a very concrete way. And finally, we need to be thoughtful about how we're getting traction, how we're growing users, both manually and scalably. And so those are the 4 steps of the loop that we're constantly going through until we find product market fit.
Okay, so let's walk through it step by step. So the initial product market fit narrative, right? Like when you use a big term like strategy, people are like, oh shit, like this is serious. Like I gotta think through this 10 hours. But like, what are some key questions that people should answer to write this narrative?
Yeah, I totally agree with you that oftentimes the strategy word is this very amorphous thing, but I try to make it extremely concrete. That a strategy means answering 6 questions for the product that you're building. The first is, what's the problem you're solving for the customer? Everything we build is solving some problem. Even entertainment products like Netflix are, helping solving boredom. So you want to identify what that problem is. Second, you want to identify who's the target audience. Who are you building this for? We could be building for lots of different audiences, but we want to be thoughtful about which audience is going to resonate most with our product and service. The third is the value proposition. This idea of what is your solution? What is your unique way of solving this problem? The fourth is competitive advantage. Why are people going to pick your product relative to everything else that exists in the market? And I think that's an interesting one because oftentimes there might be competitors that are doing more interesting things and people adopt that solution instead of yours. Then we need to figure out the growth strategy, which is how are we going to acquire users? And finally, what's our business model? How are we going to actually make money from our product? Now, the question I often get is why these 6? Well, it turns out these 6 are the most common reasons that startups fail when they get it wrong. They either didn't identify a problem that was acute enough. They didn't find a target audience that resonated with it. They built a product, but they couldn't grow, or they couldn't make money from their product. So those are all examples of failure due to not getting one of these 6 right. So the idea is that you start with a perspective on all 6. And you don't need a lot of detail, right? You can write this up in a 1-pager or 2-pager. That's all you need initially, but you're starting with a hypothesis, a set of guesses for where you think the opportunity is for your product.
And is there a reason why the problem question comes before the who is the customer question? Or it can be switched? Yeah. Do you have thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I actually go back and forth on this. What do you start with, the target audience or the problem? And the reality is I've seen different startups do it different ways. Sometimes they start with a problem to solve, but ultimately they end up pivoting to a different audience that feels that problem more acutely. Other times they start with a very specific audience that they're passionate about, and then they figure out which problem they want to tackle. And so you can go either way with these things. And so I don't think there's a right answer about which one you start with.
Got it. I guess one shortcut is a lot of founders build for themselves. Like they are the customer. So then they think about, okay, what are some problems that I'll actually pay for or that I actually want to solve, right?
I'm a huge fan of that approach. I've done that for a lot of my own startups. My current startup, No Choice, exactly that, solving my own pain. I think the thing to be careful of, you got to make sure you can find an audience that's large enough that resonates with that same problem that you personally have. But as long as you can do that, building for yourself is a great way to go. Okay,
so now let's talk about the validating the riskiest assumption step. We talk about how just shipping crappy MVP is maybe not the right way to validate stuff. But what are some other ways we can use to validate our riskiest assumptions?
Yeah, so what I talk about is there's so many ways to validate, many of which are cheaper than building an MVP, right? So anything from customer interviews to surveys, to smoke tests, to pre-sales, to prototypes, to growth tests and product tests. And so the key thing is we want to think about what are in fact our riskiest assumptions with our product strategy. And so what I encourage folks to do is start with broad-based validation, things like customer interviews that help you to assess across all of these 6 dimensions of your product strategy, which ones might be the riskiest. And then to start picketing the right validation technique depending on what's your riskiest assumption. So for example, when I was building Connected, a contact management tool back in the day, what we realized was our riskiest assumption was willingness to pay. It turns out there's plenty of people who had launched products like Plaxo and Zovni that had gotten millions of users, but no one was willing to pay. And so because we knew that a willingness to pay was our riskiest assumption, we could then decide what tests to go do to solve for it. And so in our case, for example, at the time, what everyone was doing was MVPs. Just launch a free version of your product and you'll worry about the business model later. We took a different approach. We actually launched the product with a price tag from day one. And we actually made our free trial very short, 14 days. And that's because we wanted to figure out very quickly, was there anyone willing to pay for this stuff? Now, I'm so glad we did this because when we launched Connected, this is back in the day where TechCrunch was the main way you launched. We launched and Connected was featured in TechCrunch. But man, in the comments on the first day, we had so many haters. They're like, who would ever pay for this? Why are they charging for this thing? This should be free. And we were really nervous. Maybe we made the wrong decision. And so we actually were really glad we only set our free trial for 14 days because on the 15th day, we got a bunch of paid subscribers. Yep. And that was incredibly clarifying to us on who our target audience was. Because there was a bunch of free users that were playing around with it, but the ones that were paying, we quickly discovered were outbound professionals, people who are in the business of managing relationships. And so that became a clear customer segment for us to go after. And so it was a great way for us to validate this assumption of would people be willing to pay? And it turns out they would, but a very specific audience that was in the business of relationships. We then were able to tailor all the features we were building specifically around that.
Yeah, that's a great example. A lot of people will use a product for free, but when you ask them to pay, they're like, no, I don't want to pay for this. And that's a great way to answer the who is the customer. Like if you just like, you know, like you said, just like make them pay and then people will self-filter themselves into a segment, right? I interviewed Noah Kagan, the guy who runs AppSumo, and he has this really great challenge. It's called the 48-hour challenge. And it's kind of like pre-sales. He basically pitches his ideas to his friends and he just makes them like prepay for it. Like, you know, here's my idea. Are you putting $100 for me to build this and give it to you? If I never build it, I'll give it back to you. I'll give the $100 back to you. And that is like a really great way to just like validate your idea as soon as possible. I haven't done it yet because it's a little bit like asking your friends to pay feels kind of weird to me, but it seems like a great way, like a great hack.
You know, I've actually done that on the B2B side with pre-sales with LinkedIn Sales Navigator. We were working on this new premium subscription for sales professionals called LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And we actually leveraged pre-sales to solve for a bunch of issues. What minimum feature set needs to be in the V1? And are people going to be willing to pay for it at the premium price point we wanted to charge them? And so what we did was we created a sales deck and we actually went to potential customers, pitched it. The sales deck had our value proposition. It had screenshots of what the product was going to look like. It had a price tag associated with it. And so we'd go pitch it and say, hey, look, here's the product we're planning on building. Are you willing to commit to join our pilot program? Now, the commitment wasn't money. We were going to give it to them for free, but we did ask them as part of the contract they had to sign was, you're going to deploy this to 15 salespeople. You allow all of them to go through training and a subset of them will join us every week for feedback. And so everyone knows a sales team, dedicating time from the sales team is the same as money. If they're not selling, they're not making money. And so it was a real commitment for them to go do that. And so we'd go do this. And the goal was if we got 40% of people to say yes, we felt like the product was validated and it was time to go build it. Now, initially, we didn't get anywhere near that. We had a ton of folks that were just like, no, not interested. We have other priorities. So we had to keep adding features and iterating on our value prop until we got there. But we eventually did. And at that point, when we were just building it, we knew we were building something that was pre-validated, both from a willingness to pay, as well as our V1 feature set.
Yeah, that's great. That kind of brings to the third part of this, about like, you know, how do you know if you have I guess, a bunch of people prepay for it and hopefully you ship a good product that maybe you have product market fit. What are some other ways to measure if you actually have product market fit?
Yeah, so I think we've gone through this evolution of how do you measure product market fit. We started with, Mark Andreessen back in the day, even saying you can always feel when you have product market fit because the product's flying off the shelves. It's really hard to measure a feeling. So, we've moved on beyond that approach. We then moved to a world of surveys. People talk about using NPS survey or product market fit surveys, asking things like, how disappointed would you be if this product no longer existed, for example? Now, here's the problem with surveys. You have huge response bias. The people who tend to respond to your survey are the ones that are still engaged, right? So the set of users that abandoned you months ago aren't filling out your survey and telling you whether they'd be disappointed or not, whether your product exists. And so these surveys always overrepresent your engaged users and end up not being a great way to understand whether you have product market fit. We've now moved to a world where it's all about using metrics to assess whether you have product market fit or not. And really, it's around two metrics. The first is retention, and then the second is growth. And so with retention, the idea is you figure out the core action in your product. You then map a retention curve, and you look at, does that retention curve flatten over time? Because if it flattens over time, it means there's a subset of users that are staying retained and are going to keep using your product in the long term. That's what you need to have product market fit. Now, what ends up happening when you first launch a product is that trend line always trends to zero. You have to work at improving your product, either new functionality or optimizing the experience to get it to the point where it flattens. But when it does, you have some semblance of product market fit. Now, the second measure is growth. Are you growing? The reason this is important is, some people leave it at the retention metric, but it never feels like you have product market fit if your product's not growing. So for example, AOL has product market fit on the retention piece, right? But no one would consider that a product that has product market fit because it's not growing. And so for the growth piece, what we want to test is, are you growing your month over month users? Do you have more users in the next month than you did in the previous month? So that's the first part. And the second part is, are you doing that sustainably? We can always throw money at the problem to grow our user base, but we want to make sure it's sustainable. This idea, for example, that let's say we're using paid ad spend, that we're recovering that paid ad spend in a decent payback period against the customer revenue. And so there's a test that you can go run to see if that's the case. And so we're trying to make sure our new user growth is sustainable. But if we have both, we have retention, a flattened retention curve, and we have month over month growth, you certainly have product market fit.
Got it. Yeah. I think number one is it's actually very hard for the retention curve to flatten up, right? I think people don't realize how hard it is. But even like you said, that's a good point, because even if it flattens out, you might only have product market fit for a very specific niche. And if you want to do a big business or just pay yourself, that might not be enough, right? So yeah.
That's exactly right. And that's where I think you need the growth measure equally as much as you need the retention metric.
Yeah. And I love the survey point too. We just got finished with the elections. All the surveys were basically wrong, right? The people responded to surveys were biased.
Totally. And that's the great thing about data. When you think about it, using something like retention, you're surveying 100% of your users because you're actually looking at every single data point. You're not relying on this percentage of people that tend to respond.
Yeah. Okay, so basically you go through define the product market fit narrative, you validate your assumptions, and you try to measure progress, and then you define narrative again, and you keep going back and forth, right? And then at some point, you actually have some single product market fit, and then you want to scale and you want to get more traction. Let's close with that. How do you go about scaling when you have product market fit?
So I think the thing that we've learned about getting traction in this hunt for product market fit is that we really need to take a two-prong approach. The first prong is the idea of doing things that don't scale. Just do whatever you need to do to call it your first 100 or first 1,000 users. Now, this is everything from using your personal network, using the audience you might have built, using influencers, getting PR, launching on Product Hunt, leveraging online and offline communities. All of these things are strategies that are fantastic for getting that first set of users, but is never going to scale to a scalable channel. Now, once we've gotten to that point of getting that initial traction, we then want to start working on developing a growth loop. And the whole idea with growth loops is that they are sustainable and scalable over time. And these could be anything from viral loops, where you're trying to get your users to bring in other users into the product. It could be content loops, where either you're generating content or your users are generating content that are bringing people back into the product, or a variety of paid loops, things like advertising or having a sales team or paid integrations. All of these loops are scalable because they're self-reinforcing. That a set of users brings in the next set of users, which brings in the next set of users. So that's great for scalability, but the reality is you can't get one of those flywheels going in the early days. That's why you need those other ways to manually get to that first 1,000 users. So I think that's what we've learned, that we have to take this two-prong approach to grow over time.
Got it. So yeah, like even before product market fit, like you need to do the manual approach. And at some point, the manual approach probably becomes, too overwhelming. You're having too many meetings during a day. So you want to start thinking about building growth loops and scaling that way. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about finding product market fit for your career. So back in 2015, you were leading sales navigator at LinkedIn, right? Can you describe what the job was like? What did you love about it? What did you not like about it? Yeah.
It was sort of this amazing time where everything was actually on paper going really well for my career. I had pitched LinkedIn on this idea that we should build a sales tool dedicated to sales professionals. And they said, great, you go figure that out. You go build it. And initially I had a venture team of like 12 folks working on that. But this eventually became a very strategic project for the company. And we grew the team very quickly to almost 500 people. And I became co-GM of this with our head of sales. And it was going great. It ultimately became the fastest growing revenue line for LinkedIn. I had direct P&L responsibility for this business that was now 200 million in revenue. And I was doing this at a publicly traded company. And so on paper, I was doing really well. And my boss was telling me, what other products could we have you take over since you've done such a great job of this? And there's a clear path to becoming a VP. And what's interesting about it was, while I was doing well on paper, I found so much of it draining in terms of the work that I was doing. And what do I mean by that? Look, I got into product to talk to customers, design world-class features. I didn't really talk to customers as much. I had a whole team of PMs that did that. The extent at which I was designing features was product reviews. My PMs would present to me various concepts and I'd provide a little bit of feedback. And sure, I own the high level vision and strategy, but that day-to-day fun that I loved about product, I actually did little of. I was a head of a product, managing and leading more so than I was creating and building. And I realized that kind of work didn't sort of energize me. And I love the way Justin Kahn puts this. He talks about this idea of a zone of excellence versus a zone of genius. He says there's this zone of excellence that some of us fall into. This is work that we're really good at, but it's actually very draining to us. And that's where I was at. And what he encourages you to do is find this zone of genius. The zone of genius is the work that energizes you, that you love. And so I realized that while I was doing well, if I continued on that path, I was just going to move further and further away from the parts of product that I actually love. And so I thought about, is this really the path I want to keep going down? Because I'm not sure it would really be my zone of genius.
And how did you think about, because you had this realization, but at the same time, you're rising up the career ladder, you're getting paid more. And so how do you actually make the decision to stop this path and do something else? Must have been tough.
It's super tough. And I think that part is always hard. I think for me, I often think about this idea that Jeff Bezos talks about, this framework of regret minimization. And this idea that, what would you regret? And how do you solve for minimizing those regrets? And I think it's always easy to look at the career ladder, the more status, wealth, money that you're making, and keep climbing that. But I was starting to feel this potential regret that maybe there's a more optimal career path I could be going down that was more aligned with what gave me energy, that I might regret never pursuing that if I keep going down the path of the traditional career path. And so that really was a guiding force for me. And part of it was like, I kind of felt like I can always go back if it didn't work out. If I tried something else and it didn't work out, that path was available to me, but I would regret not trying to find something that was closer to my zone of genius.
Got it. Like I feel like corporations should, like I'm very much similar to you. I like to craft products and go through that iteration phase. And I feel like corporations should reward these people more, right? Like, it takes a lot of work to craft a really great product. It's not easy. And why only reward in a ladder people who are good at like managing orgs or like trying to like manage up? Why not actually reward people who are actually shipping really good products? I don't know if you've seen some of that happen now. It's more like an IC path, but like, what are your thoughts on this?
Totally. I think what was interesting is this was a real challenge during ZERP times, right? Like when the economy was great, everyone sort of wanted to be promoted. And so the only path for that was this idea of you manage more people. So you move into these leadership roles, and that was the path to, more wealth and money and status and everything. Now, what I think is fascinating with sort of the flattening of organizations, some people really are starting to embrace this idea of a dual track PM role where, hey, look, if someone is independently sort of an ICPM working on a big, hairy problem and really delivering outcomes, we should reward that as opposed to simply asking for them to become people managers. And so I think we're finally starting to see a little bit of it. I think engineering still is way better at this, having a dual track career path where you can be a very senior IC engineer and do really well. PMs, it's still pretty rare, but at least we're starting to see a beginning of that happening. And I hope that only continues to happen.
Yeah, I know this technical director who on the engineering side, who has probably the best job. He just doesn't have any meetings. He just comes in, makes some architecture discussions. He dives deep, trying to fix some bugs. And it's like a much better life from my perspective than just like being stuck in alignment meetings all day.
Totally. So, like we talk about this with engineering, like sometimes you have a separate CTO from a VP of engineering, right? The CTO is about the technical decisions, the architecture, the technical strategy versus the VP of engineering is the one who's actually managing all the people. And you realize both of those people are doing exactly what they're great at, working in their zone of genius. And I do think there's an opportunity to do something similar on product. And so I hope the trend continues.
Just to go a little bit deeper on this, like, I think you and I both have friends who are like CPO and like, who are in the senior leadership positions. What does it take to actually like love this work? Or like, are there people who are like really love it and people who are like really miserable in it?
Yeah. I think you have both where people are doing it because that was the natural career progression. But then there's certainly people who this is the best role for them. And I think what I realized when I was at LinkedIn, kind of leading sales navigators ahead of product, you have to reorient to the team is your product as opposed to the product that you're shipping. And so you're much more obsessed about the team as the vehicle for delivery for products and how do you make that engine incredible, right? So like I spent a lot of time on, for example, my all hands meetings because I knew I was going to bring 500 people together, spend 500 people hours. I better make it really useful to drive alignment and cohesion and strategic thinking amongst that entire group, right? And so the team was my product. There's a whole set of people that I know who love that, who thrive after cultivating a team, building that team, seeing that team ultimately be successful, and they value their ability to grow that team. And I think that's the kind of person who really thrives in those kind of roles.
Got it. And so like when you left your job at LinkedIn, what kind of conversations, maybe you can share this, like did your wife support you? Like did your manager think you were making a big mistake? Like what kind of conversations do you remember that you had?
Yeah, it was interesting. I got a lot of discussions at LinkedIn with folks that were like, hey, look, you're making a huge mistake. You're actually doing really well here. And we have lots of career growth opportunities for you that you can still have here. And so to me, though, what was nice about that is that gave me assurance that, hey, look, I can come back, right? Whether it's at LinkedIn or a different company, there were roles I could have if this other experiment doesn't work out. Now, Ada, my wife, has always been super supportive of trying to find the space where you're operating in your zone of genius. And so she was actually very supportive of running the experiment wherever it might take us.
Awesome. And you actually run NoJoy with your wife, right? You guys are working on it together.
That's right. So what we ultimately decided to do, I left LinkedIn. She ultimately left her job at SurveyMonkey, and we decided to start a company together. Now, this wasn't our first company together. It's actually our second. We had previously started Connected, a contact management tool together, and that's the one that we actually sold to LinkedIn. And so that's how we both ended up at LinkedIn for a while. We loved it, and so we decided to do it again. And so the thought was, with this startup, we want to build something that we felt like we could own the craft, where we could be directly talking to customers, directly building product, and really maintain our own sort of bar on what we thought was great craft and great product. And that felt like it would be far more energizing than being a people manager. And in fact, we went with an extreme focus of minimum viable team. How do we make this team as small as possible? Literally just Ada and I, and seeing how far we could take the business without sort of all the scaling of people. And so that was really the thought on a path that we thought would be way better aligned with what we wanted to get in terms of out of our careers.
Yeah, like I feel like you were ahead of the time, man. Like, because right now it's all about like keep the team small, maybe like trying to bootstrap stuff. It's all taking a bunch of VC funding, like all the stuff you did already, right? With your startup. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, like, our yardstick has never been what's our top line revenue and how fast that's growing. We're kind of more like, what's our revenue per employee? Because like, we love this idea of leverage. Like, what can we do in a leveraged way? Because we find life is simpler with fewer employees. There's less red tape. There's less people to convince. And in fact, you can be more nimble. And you're right. Everyone's talking about this now. We've seen the great flattening in all the big tech companies, but that always seems so logical to me that I'm kind of more surprised that there was a period of time where we always felt like more and more employees is somehow going to result in more output, which sounds kind of crazy these days.
Yeah. So let's say people want to follow your footsteps, whether they want to do a startup or just like, go back to the craft in their job. I think you have this framework called passion, skill, and opportunity fit. Maybe it's kind of like similar to zone of genius, but like, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think some people have this whole idea of follow your passion. And that's sort of the mantra they talk about. I honestly think that's too simplistic. That simply following your passion isn't going to work. Like, hey, look, I am super passionate about music, but I suck at singing. I'm not great at playing instruments. Like, if I try to go after this in a big way, I'm unlikely to be successful. So I'm fine keeping music a hobby, but it's probably not a great career. And so instead, I think the framework to think about is you really got to balance these three things. Passion's important, of course, but I think you got to be more nuanced about passion. I realize with passion, there's passion for the mission, which is sort of the thing you're trying to accomplish. But then there's passion for the day-to-day. Do you love what you have to do on a day-to-day basis to get to where you want to solve for? And I think you need both. And I think oftentimes some people have one passion for the mission, but not for the day-to-day. And so they're in lacking alignment that they need to solve for. Now, the second one is skill. We obviously got to be good at what you're trying to accomplish to be successful. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be good at it now. You can have a path to be learning to be great at it, but we all have proclivities where some things are going to be easier for us to master and other things are just not going to be great areas for us to master. And so understanding where you have a likely path to skill development in the space you're in is super important. And finally, the last dimension is opportunity. Is there market interest in the role that you're thinking about, right? There has to be market opportunity. And that's, are there jobs? Are there roles for you? Are people willing to pay for this dream job that you have? And so I often think about it as I'm trying to find this intersection of passion, skill, and opportunity. And when you find that sweet spot, then you're set up for success because you're energized by the work you're doing every day. You get to mastery in terms of skill development, which is also very fulfilling. And oh, by the way, it's paying the bills, right? Like you found a role that can actually enable you to be successful. And so I think that's the holy grail. Now, of course, that's hard to do, but I think that's a right framework to be striving for.
I do think that maybe passion needs to come first, like especially the day-to-day passion. Like if you're intrinsically motivated by whatever you're doing, like for example, I'm learning the piano. I'm not very good, but I just enjoy doing it. So if you just do that, you enjoy doing it, then the skill hopefully will come. So yeah, I think the day-to-day is like very underrated. Like, you gotta enjoy doing it. You gotta find the torture that you love that other people might not like, you know?
Totally. No, I 100% agree with that. I think that is a great way to think about what you're actually passionate about. Like, what do you actually like that other people don't like as much is a great frame.
Yeah. And how do you go about figuring out what you're passionate about? Like, you know, what you're passionate about. How do you go about figuring this out?
Yeah, it's a great question because so many people don't really know what it is yet, especially early in their career. And so the framework I like to use is this explore and exploit algorithm idea. So let me set this up. So there's this famous problem in computer science where let's say you have 3 slot machines and you're trying to maximize your payout. And so you can run a slot machine to see how successful that machine is for paying out some rewards. It has some probability of paying it out. And so you have these 3 slot machines. And so how do you maximize the amount of payout that you're going to get from these slot machines? And what you realize in every possible solution, you do this idea of explore and exploit. Explore is, hey, let's try all 3 of these to try to figure out which one is ultimately going to be the highest rewarding thing. And so that's this idea of exploring. And then we exploit. Once we figure out which slot machine is driving the most reward, we double down on that one, right? And so the idea when applied to your own career is that we should be thinking about early on our career, exploring everything. How many different internships can we have? How many different jobs can we do? How many volunteer opportunities can we have to start to feel out what are we excited about? What do we like about these things? And so much of this has to be tried firsthand. You can't just think about whether you would enjoy and be passionate about something. You have to try it. And so early on, it really behooves you to explore. But then ultimately, once you start to find areas that you're excited about, you want to exploit. You want to double down on them. Okay, you think you have this passion for this mission or this space, go after it. Go try a role deeply in that space and double down on it. And so that's the exploitation. And over time, you end up exploiting more than exploring. But the key part is that at every stage, you should keep exploring, right? Like I remember even when I was working on NoChoy, I was like asking myself, wow, this like climate change tech that everyone's working on seems very interesting and mission driven. Maybe I should go in that direction. And so I sort of tried that on for size and ultimately realized it wasn't for me, but I'm constantly still trying to explore other opportunities that might be more fulfilling beyond the path that I'm currently going down right now.
I think it's very underrated to be a tinkerer and to always, even if you're old like me, to actually spend some time and just play around with stuff. For example, this morning I was playing around with Cursor to like build apps. And it might seem like a waste of time, but you might figure out, oh, this is actually really awesome. I really love doing this. And you might just kind of follow your curiosity and it could actually lead you to some really amazing places, right? So yeah, I guess the point I want to make is you don't have to be a young person. You can do it at any time in your life.
Totally. Yeah. And I agree with that. And I think that oftentimes as you get older, you stop exploring. And I think that is unfortunate because you might ultimately land on something that is more meaningful if you would continue exploring a variety of career paths.
Awesome. So Sachin, just last question. I think you being really intentional about your career, your life, you found product market fit for your life, it seems like. And how do you balance all these different parts of life, right? Like there's like work, there's your health, there's your relationships. Like how does someone think about this in a holistic way?
On this exact question, you know, if I were to describe my 20s, I was your typical tech workaholic where there was really nothing to my life other than work. And it was my source of meaning. It was my source of relationships. All the coworkers and colleagues were my friends. And I got so much out of it. But then I began to realize, wait a minute, maybe there's a little bit more to life. And I think for me, it took a couple things. Part of it was having a daughter, right? You and I both have kids, and we know that really changes your perspective on life. And I think ultimately I began to appreciate, maybe there's more to life than work. And one of my favorite books on this topic is a book called Designing Your Life by Bill Burnett. And he talks about what if we're intentional about designing our life in the same way we design products. And what I found most helpful is he had sort of a framework of there's kind of 4 areas of life that we should all be thinking about. One is career, but second is health. Third is love and relationships. And fourth is this idea of play, doing stuff for fun and joy. And I've actually now used this framework to think about how I'm doing on all 4 categories. I had a whole time in my life where I was 100% focused on health, cleaned up my diet, got to the point where I was exercising pretty much every day. And now it's been hugely fruitful to have the time and space to focus on that. I then spent a bunch of time in relationships, building better friends and really having meaning around that. Now, the hardest one for me was joy, because it was sort of this thing where, like most people, I have a need to be productive, that I was really struggling to think of what do I do for pure joy? And so I really tasked myself to come up with something. And as I mentioned, I love music. I love it And so one of my goals was to listen to 100 albums, purely because it's sort of like a source of joy. There's no productivity in it, but to give myself permission to do so. And it's been so fascinating that now I've gotten to the point where I do my annual resolutions, and I actually make sure I have resolutions in each of these categories: career, health, love, and play. And so it sort of focuses me around having more going on in my life than just my career. And now that I've developed things in these other categories, man, going back to my 20s when I was obsessed with work and it owned my life is something I'd never be willing to do now. But I think it took developing those other categories and developing meaning and fulfillment in those other categories before I got to appreciating that.
I love that, man. I hope the young people listening to this can realize that earlier. Because if you have good health and you have good relationships and you make time to give joy to yourself, like it will help your career too, right? So they all build on each other. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. All right, Sachin, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so best place to find me is on LinkedIn and at Sachin Rekhi. And then I actually blog on product management, entrepreneurship, and life at sachinrekhi.com. So I encourage you to check that out. And I have a couple of courses on Reforge around mastering product management and finding product market fit. So you can check those out as well.
Awesome. Yeah, like it's hard to not keep talking about product management because there's so much to rant about. But yeah, I'm glad we're both putting out content out there. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, man. This is awesome.
Sure. This was fun.